But of course, they're not going to present it as that, what we're talking about here. No, 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 it's democracy, freedom, multiculturalism, brotherhood of man, civil society. Oneness, this word that doesn't mean anything. Oneness, everybody's one. One what? I'll tell you one what. Rand says the collectivist tyranny dare not enslave a country by outright confiscation of its values, material or moral. It has to be done by a process of internal corruption, right? The philosophers, the top psychologists, they know how it's done. It's incremental, it's Fabian, very gradual, big smile on their face. And it's been whistle blown by umpteen people. Bacon, Skinner, Huxley, Orwell, Walzer, Epzoni. Insiders I'm talking about. And David R. Hawkins puts it this way in this book, Power and Force. He says that there is no antidepressant that will cure depression that's spiritually based. For the malaise does not originate from brain dysfunction, but from an accurate response to the desecration of life. The Orientalist, Jacob Burckhardt, says that in history, the way of annihilation is invariably prepared by inward degeneration. You're asking, what do we do about all this? That is what we're going to be looking at. But give them a chance, Michael. They know how to deal with your anxiety and your fear and the trauma. They know you're maxed out. They know you're ready to blow up. So they're working overtime on it. Just give them more time and more money. And soon it'll all be over. Gruen says that many patients enter therapy not in order to preserve their human feelings, which they perceive as a hindrance, but to be liberated from them. And every day we read the headlines, it's the same thing. Ready to completely sedate us. It's an old story. Reminds me of the movie Network. All necessities provided, all anxieties tranquilized, all boredom amused. You see, they wouldn't be in business without us. We rush into their arms like little Red Riding Hoods. I've explained many times before that, there's two ways to be eaten by a leviathan. It can pursue you and swallow you, or it can just sit there static and you swim of your own free will into its jaws. That's what half the human race is doing right now. That's what the global village is. I say that the anxiety-haunted man depends upon the handrails provided by society. He's the perfect citizen of the global village. He happily exchanges his name for a number and eagerly exchanges his sovereignty for security. Gustav Jung said that we have lost our superstitious fear of evil spirits and things that go bump in the night, but instead are seized with terror of people who, possessed by demons, perpetrate the frightful deeds of darkness. That the doers of these deeds think of themselves not as possessed, but as supermen, doesn't alter the fact of their possession. You see, they're just happy to oblige. We scream out for something, they're going to hand it to us. Their power comes from our complicity. Now, the power brokers don't relinquish their authority and don't hesitate to misuse it because they're firmly convinced that given what they've seen, that most people around them would gladly take their place if given half a chance. This is one of the reasons. It's really true. I mean, okay, they convince themselves of this. But they've seen it. That you give a person a chance and he becomes a tyrant. So they hold on to their power. The people who are involved in these architects of the last disaster, the financial disaster, they're back in business again. They don't even have a conscience about what they've done. Why? Because they know if somebody was sitting in my seat, they'd do the same thing. That's as far as their conscience goes. You can't talk to them. So we look briefly again, summarize these, the anatomy of tyranny, the ingredients. 5 are important. Hierarchy. That everything they do is this hierarchical model. Not that hierarchy is always necessarily negative, but it is if it's in the hands of pathological people. Right? The movement of dehumanization. The act of control, which is what? You don't control yourself, I will. I'll control you. And then, as I went into in other presentations, our identification with the object of our hate. My God, volumes can be written on this. And ultimately, total psychic enslavement. The parasite cannot live without the host. Now, by the way, hierarchy, just as a side note, those who followed my work on Atlantis, when we talk about the cataclysms and the destabilization that took place, hierarchy was needed and the aftermath of that. That's when it started to be used to give semblance of order to an incredibly disorganized existence. Somewhere about 13,000 years ago and perhaps even before. And it's been carried over It's a prehistoric concept that's been carried over from the past. That's why it's so unsustainable. And don't forget that this identification and this control also extends to them saying, okay, we know that you want to leave the cage, but we got a better idea. We'll give you a measure of our power. How's that sound? Don't leave the cage. Stay within it, but we'll give you more stripes. Most of us go, yeah, sounds good. Because true freedom, my friends, is no master above that anyone knows, but no slave below. That's the difficulty. How many people are we making dependent on us? How much tyrannizing are we doing? It's easy to say, I don't like being whipped by that bugger at work. I hate the Illuminati, I hate the big boss, I hate those boss hogs. Can't wait till they're all, out of power. But that leaves you. Who's living in your shadow? No, true freedom is no master above by all means, but also no slave below, no dependent. And that's why it's a more subtle thing, as we said in the beginning, than just simply waving placards, you see. And we're going to get into this in Age of Manipulation 3, when we come back, to look at this particular phenomenon in yet another way. Who is it that we're making dependent on us, and who is making us dependent on them in psychic vampirism? We'll be, again, examining this whole concept of evil with yet another lens, another set of focus, more intimate, more personal. The many ways that we enslave others and are enslaved. As I said, this is a very complex area. Now, this various forms of anxiety that we spoke about, and the adversaries that we have, both inner and outer, also breed two modes of escape that we need to contemplate. I alluded to it a little, just very briefly, a few minutes ago. One is the withdrawal syndrome, right, of the schizophrenic, remember? The chronic introversion. I can't handle this anymore, I don't want to know. And you just literally shut the door of your mind and your senses to the world. K-PAX, one flew over the cuckoo's nest type of syndrome. Or there's the opposite, flip side of that, the extreme hypermanic extroversion and the immersion in the mass, which is technically mania and neuroses of all descriptions. And we'll be going into that as well. Looking at many of these syndromes, 3 I can only list here briefly, is the withdrawal, as we said. That's a schizoid personality. The collapse, the person who just gives up and collapses and lets Big Brother, control them. They know that as an oral character, interesting character there, but by far the more interesting one, is the being who has committed themselves entirely to the pseudo-self, in pathological ways that most of us couldn't even fathom. They're the psychopathic personality, who very much want other people to be dependent upon them, who very much want those stripes, and will do anything to get it, and have power over you. You need to be worrying about them a hell of a lot more than you need to be worrying about what's up in the corridors of power. They are those types of beings. But in the world that we're heading into, the psychopath, the sociopath, the pretender, the psychic vampire is loose. More of them are going to be coming out of the woodwork. It's going to be like the night of the zombies. Don't think I'm kidding. Rand says that for the rational, psychologically healthy man, the desire for pleasure is the desire to celebrate his control over reality, right? Beingness. For the neurotic, the desire for pleasure is the desire to escape reality. Now, we all know how hard it is to break a pleasure habit. Rand's prodigy, Nathaniel Brandon, says that one of the hallmarks of a man who lacks self-esteem is the fact that most of his pleasures are pleasures of escape from the two pursuers whom he has betrayed and from whom there is no escape, reality and his own mind. Again, alluding to the syndromes that arise and the legitimate anxiety that comes about when you set up this dynamic within yourself, or are influenced to do so by other people. Probably one of the greatest experts on neurosis, by far, was Karen Horney. In her monumental books, she says that there is scarcely any neurosis in which the tendency to get rid of the self does not appear in direct form. It may appear in fantasies of leaving home and becoming a derelict or of losing one's identity. The tendency is present in wishes to be hypnotized, in an inclination towards mysticism, in feelings of unreality. Now check this out. In an inordinate need for sleep, in the lure for sickness, in the lure of sickness, insanity or death, in masochistic fantasies, the common denominator is a feeling of being putty in the master's hands, of being devoid of will, of all power, and of being absolutely subjected to another's domination. Isn't any of this making sense? Putty in the master's hands, hypnotism. We are master escapologists. We make Houdini look like he's on the door. How do we do it? Take a wild guess. 9 to 5. What is that? Evasion and escape. More stripes, please. I know it's a rat race, and I'm going to be the best rat. I'm going to be the fastest rat, the ugliest. That's how I get my high. I'm going to get my high. Affluence. There's nothing wrong with it, but when it becomes obsessive, as we know in these creatures, these incredibly ichthyphalic, solar cult worshipping, the normal escapes we know about, the alcohol and the drugs. Partly turning off, is it not? Partly tuning out. Or the more official version, right? I don't take the illicit drugs, but I take the medications my doctor hands me. That'll do the trick. Gene Kilhorn says, addiction is the #1 health problem in America today. Many people feel that addiction is also at the root of other problems such as crime, poverty, divorce, child abuse, and other forms of violence. Others argue it is these problems that lead to the addiction. Another classic one. The All-Father, the All-Solve. I divorce myself into the Mittelwelt, into the Umwelt, to the God behind the clouds and his representatives. There's always some guy, there's always someone, there's always some Zeus with a thunderbolt. But the religion is, as you know, the double-headed eagle, right? We've been tenderized. Remember that serfdom that's coming, the global village? The technicians, the geneticists, the builders of the global village, these politician types, they are just taking the trowel, the Masonic trowel, over from the guys who've passing the baton on. For centuries, we've been tenderized for this collectivism and this globalism by religion. Now they get tired or it's out of date, and they just hand the baton over to their cronies. They're all allies, they all breed mysteria. And what also does this entail? We go to religion often very meaningfully. Remember, we have tragedy in our life, we reach out. Originally, the goal of the priest was to comfort us. Sorge, care. Cure, the very word cure meant care, to remind you of the higher meaning of life. They were ostensibly there to do that, but now they're not that. We reach out to these people positively to get that sucker that we need, to get those explanations. You know what it's called? Strangling yourself in the webs that they've created in the attempt to make yourself free. That's how clever and cunning they are. They know you're going to want to be free. They know that life is very difficult. They know there's lots of challenges, and they know that your imperial self is screaming to be free. But they've designed this web. It's fascinating to study. They've designed it so that you strangle yourselves in the very attempts to be free from it. By running to these religious people who just lead you on a wild goose chase. And the New Age movement, 9 times out of 10, it's the same story. Following the tiger out of the long grass. Fighting them with the weapons they've handed us. Theodore Reich says that to a primitive mind, all evil comes from outside. Famine, death, and illness are the result of some malicious sorcerer or demon. That's the other trick, isn't it? All my problems are, you're the creator of it. I have no responsibility. The world is full of evil demons, and the gods have to be propitiated, since they too want to harm poor human beings. Erich Fromm says that just as the deity is conceived as omnipotent and omniscient, man is conceived as being powerless and insignificant. Only as he can gain grace or help from the deity, by complete surrender, can he feel strength. Submission to a powerful authority is one of the avenues by which man escapes from his feelings of aloneness and limitation. In the act of surrender, he loses his independence and integrity as an individual, but he gains the feeling of being protected by the awe-inspiring power of which, as it were, he becomes a part. Twisted wrong. Mikhail Bakunin, founder of anarchism, said that the first revolt is against the supreme tyranny of theology of the phantom of God, As long as we have a master in heaven, we will always be slaves on earth. But it doesn't need to be the fundamentalism. The world is wall to wall with this collectivism, posing under the guise of theology and loss of selfhood. It's even in other forms, as I said in the New Age movement. Nice words, wrong tongue. And anyway, what is a spring cleaning lark? You think that this jive, just spring cleaning is all that is required? Little hypnotism? No way. This is just one seasoned world stuff. We have to go to the roots of the problem. This is Pluto. Nothing else will do. Nothing else will work. None of this Svengali topical stuff is going to work. The others, what do we do to escape it? The inauthentic forms of rebellion, which I've spoken before, which is just the flip side of the coin of conformity. Just because you have you're jaded, you have dissatisfaction with the world didn't accept you, doesn't mean that you're an authentic being who's worked it all out. Talk about rebellion, we got plenty of rebellion. We got the chic, metro, sexy, Bono version. That works, right? They wheel them out. Wheel them out, wheel them out. We know they're getting anxious. We know they want to throw stones and stuff. They're getting out of control. You know, write a beginner's guide. Rebellion for Dummies. And they have their people's champions. And it works. Remember that Charlie Chaplin movie? He runs down the road, a red flag fell off the back of a truck, but it was just a stonemason's truck, and he's running down the road, waving it, and all the people pour out thinking he's a leader of communism. They all run behind him as he runs down the road. That's it. Every time I see these characters, I think of that. They're the vicars and high priests of the global village. They're the Pied Pipers. We subscribe to the latest national fantasy. We have consensus trance. We don't have individuality. We believe their crap about the perfect society and goodness and equality and this concept of oneness. I asked the question, because they keep promising us freedom and everything, you know, do we really want freedom? It was alluded to earlier. Or really what we want is freedom from freedom. See, I'm not personally convinced we want freedom. I've not seen enough evidence for it. Changing chains of iron for chains of gold, yes, that I've seen. Changing, I'm uncomfortably numb, I'd like to be comfortably numb, that I've seen in plenty. But the true absolute striving for psychological freedom, that's in the mad and the insane and the outsiders, the few. As de Villars says, freedom is the last thing he wants. He functions according to the principle of pleasure in non-freedom. To be sentenced to lifelong freedom is a worse fate than lifelong slavery. To put it another way, a man is always searching for someone and something to enslave him, for only as a slave does he feel secure. Leader above, leader below, boss above, boss below, boss to the left, boss to the right. Now I'm happy. And the building has to be square. Plenty of squares, please. Plenty of cubicles. I don't want to lose it. Gustave Le Bon, the man should know, he wrote the first book on collectivism, The Crowd. Fascinating book, the first one to speak about crowd mentality, the herd mentality. He says the masses have never thirsted after truth. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim. Gruen goes on to say, we would rather forgive the evil proliferating all around us than the rebellion against it, which we mistake for the true evil. Look how twisted we become. And the famous quote by Howard Zinn, always worth repeating. Civil disobedience is not our problem. Our problem is civil obedience. Our problem is that numbers of people all over the world have obeyed the dictates of the leaders of their governments and have gone to war, and millions have been killed because of this obedience. Our problem is that the people are obedient all over the world in the face of poverty and starvation and stupidity and war and cruelty. Our problem is that people are obedient while the jails are full of petty thieves. And all the while, the grand thieves are running the country. That's our problem. This prediction of the end times, obviously, this is a prediction that the Hopi have called it Koyanskatsi for centuries. The Vedic people knew about it centuries ago. It's not new either. But let's get out of our minds any concept that it's going to be any type of physical cataclysm. I've been saying this from day one. It's psychological cataclysm, psychic life, ego, one phase of ego life is ending. There's an extinction happening, all right, but it's not an extinction on a physical. There's something about the human mind that's known as a projection. You project outward into the world what is really going on in the psyche. So the disasters that everyone's predicting are not in any shape or form. Not that psychology can't ultimately then affect the matter. We know that that happens. But let's never fool ourselves for an instant. What does it mean? Existence itself becomes illegal. Permission to think? What happens if the major goes, no? Whoever gave you permission to think? That was bad enough. What happens if it becomes permission to exist? That's where we're heading. And what happens if the answer is no? Not exist as the way you want. The way we tell you? Yeah, maybe we'll think about that. Now, this war of attrition concerns the gradual movement towards the voluntary relinquishment of freedom. Stage by stage, step by step, our masters remove the beingness from the human until humans are so collectivized and alienated that their own existence is of secondary importance than the existence of the hive in which they serve. What this also means, and we'll look at it a little bit later as well briefly, is that the anxiety works for these collectivists and globalists. The anxiety to be outside that consensus trance is so deep, so intense, that we bang on the doors to get back in. This is another thing they're hoping for, by the way. You know, the anxiety of the outsider in the end defeats him, and he screams to be let back in. It's basically psychic extinction, and it's been predicted by numerous people. Sigmund Freud had it down somewhat obliquely, and that's just simply because he was working on it, and he described it as thanatos. And Erich Fromm, his contemporary psychologist, rephrased it necrophilia in the true sense of what that word means, which is a love of death. And Freud used the Greek term thanatos. Right? They talked about this instinct of self-negation, self-mutilation, self-sadism. Freud, in his own words, says, starting from speculations on the beginning of life and from biological parallels, I drew the conclusion that besides the instinct to preserve a living substance, there must exist another contrary instinct seeking to dissolve those units and bring them back to their primeval inorganic state. That is to say, as well as an eros, life instinct, there was also an instinct of death. This has been very controversial. It's an ongoing dispute whether this exists or not. Well, I think it does. And the man who really did the homework to clarify the problem was the man on the left, Otto Rank, who was one of the great existentialist psychologists I was mentioning earlier. The founder of existential psychology is Ludwig Binswanger, and Otto Rank was one of the greatest spokesmen of it, and a brilliant, brilliant thinker who helped modernize and give some flesh to this concept that Freud had left hanging somewhat, this concept of thanatos. And do you know what Otto Rank said that thanatos was, the death instinct was? Nothing more than the very immersion in the collective we've been talking about. The loss of selfhood and the immersion of an individual in the mass. That's the death instinct. A radical new way of looking at it, and the right one. Because he understood that the sick individual creates the sick society, right? The toxic individual creates the toxic society. And it is this trend of this immersion that is absolutely the ingredient of the post-human era and the global village. Plato said it 300 BC or more. States are as men, they grow out of human characters. Now, what are the consequences of never facing the self? We've been talking about that. What are the consequences of it? What happens if people refuse completely to ever do any of this we were talking about? And they're immersed entirely in the lives of other people and in their own development and whatever else Big Brother can design tomorrow on their conveyor belts and put through their media networks, right? What's going to be the consequence? Gerrymander expresses in one line, self-alienation has reached such a degree that it can experience its own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order. That's what's coming. Destruction he accepting, that's guaranteed. But what is he saying? Like picking a scab? You're actually going to, the next pleasure, the next high, is that restaurant at the end of the universe. Douglas Adams, come and have a front row seat. Cocktails all around while you watch the universe explode. Used to be fiction. If the poor man was alive, he'd be, horror struck. It's on its way. But Ayn Rand reminds us, psychologically, the choice to think or not is the choice to focus or not. Because you have to think about something, don't you? Existentially, the choice to focus or not is the choice to be conscious or not. Metaphysically, the choice to be conscious or not is the choice of life or death. So it is destruction that we're talking about. The fundamental pylons, are being removed gradually in the night, nibbled at by some very cunning serpentine beings who understand a lot about this. What was Freud talking about there? What was Rand saying? They're talking about the connection between physical and psychic energy. They are aware of it, you see. They're aware of this intimate connection, like the shaman of old were, like the ancients were, of these intimate connections between the micro and the macrocosm, or the Eigenwelt and the Mitwelt and the Unwelt. There's connections, psychic connections between them. And if we don't know what they are, you can better believe they do. The masters know all about those connections. And as we said before, ignorance is the key. They depend on us not knowing. There's a hell of a lot that changes if we do know, and we do start finding out. Steve Biko, the South African activist, beaten to death in a cell. You think he didn't know? He said himself, the most powerful tool in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. If you don't occupy the white squares, they will. Because ignorance is the key. And the Illuminati, so-called, the Atmas, the dividers, the Davids, the communitarians, whatever you want to call them, these people are born from the womb of our own ignorance.